Hi there, my name is Kyan and welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be an interesting one. So I'm currently working on two videos. In one video I will explain the mindset behind the rune setups and build pods and how you as an individual can come up with your own runes and builds. However, I am aware that the rune system for new players or for lower elo players can be quite overwhelming. And if you haven't really had the opportunity to experiment with all the different rune setups, it might be quite hard to come up with your own rune pages. That's where this video comes in. I'm going to simplify the process for all those Vladimir mains out there who need it. So I'm going to discuss all the Rune Keystones that are viable on Vladimir specifically at this point in time. Specifically, I'm going to talk about Electrocute, Summon Airy, Phase Rush, First Strike and Conqueror. I know that Conqueror might seem as a weird keystone on Vladimir and that First Strike might even seem delusional, but I'm going to explain everything into detail, so don't worry. Alright, let's start with splitting the runes up into three groups. The first group contains Electrocute and Airy, which are obviously aggressive rune setups. These runes will mainly help you with solo kills and lane priority. In the second group we have Phase Rush. This rune will mainly help you with scaling instead of lane priority. And last but not least, in the third group we have Conqueror and the First Strike rune. Okay, so let's start with the first group, which has Electrocute and Airy. Both Electrocute and Airy have the same utility. They're both keystones that will help you with fist fighting your lane opponent so that you can contest lane priority or even get yourself solo kills. Both runes give you extra damage, which can be useful in lane because in early game nobody has a lot of damage. So every bit of extra damage you can get in the early game can really help you kill your lane opponent. However, towards the later stages of the game, everyone will have multiple items and the extra damage that these runes give you will be less significant. So the similarities of these runes are that you want to pick them when you want to focus on killing your lane opponent or contesting prio in lane. The disadvantage of these runes is that they don't scale that well. You use Electrocute and Airy to dominate the early game, but not the late game. Now what's the difference between Airy and Electrocute? Or let me put it this way, when do you want to pick Electrocute and when do you want to pick Airy? They're both very similar, so in a lot of situations you could perfectly go both, depending on the mini runes you want to select. However, Airy is easier to use. In order to use your Airy keystone, all you have to do is attack your enemy. You can either auto-attack your enemy or use your abilities, and in both situations you will use Airy. So Airy is very easy to use. With Electrocute that might not always be the case. In order to use your Electrocute, you need to hit the enemy with 3 separate attacks or abilities within 3 seconds. Obviously, this makes it a lot harder to use your Electrocute compared to Airy. Okay, so when do you actually go Electrocute and when do you go Airy? Well, we've already established that you pick Electrocute in matchups where you can proc it consistently and use Airy in matchups where you can't proc Electrocute consistently. On top of that, it's important to consider the mini runes. Rune pages offer more than just their keystones such as Electrocute or Airy. Rune pages also have what I like to call mini runes such as Nimbus Cloak, Gathering Storm, Taste of Blood, etc. Obviously, if I'm convinced that I need Nimbus Cloak and Transcendence in my game, then I will have to go Airy because these mini runes belong to the sorcery rune tree. I hope that makes sense. Alright, let's move on to the second group, which has Phase Rush. Phase Rush gives you movement speed and slow resistance. This is perfect for teamfighting and side laning. One of Vladimir's biggest weaknesses is his low mobility. Even if you're extremely fat on Vladimir, it's not always easy to hard carry your game because of your lack of mobility. You're nothing with having a lot of damage if you can't reach the enemies to damage them. The movement speed and slow resistance that Phase Rush gives you make sure that when you're team fighting, the enemies can't simply slow you and walk away from you. This allows you to damage the enemies as much as possible. This extra movement speed and slow resistance can also help you running people down in the side lane or escaping dangerous situations. Next to the keystone, the sorcery rune tree offers a lot of tools that can help you scale, such as Gathering Storm and Transcendence. So hopefully I made it clear that when your goal is to 1v9 teamfights and outscale everyone in the game, you should pick Phase Rush. Alright, let's move on to the last group, which contains Conqueror and First Strike. Let's start with Conqueror. Elite 500, the rank 1 Vladimir, has recently started using Conqueror. As a consequence, I've had a lot of people ask me, is Conqueror viable, should I go it in my games, etc. So let me explain. In theory, Conqueror sounds really good on Vladimir. Conqueror allows you through a stacking system with both auto attacks and abilities to gain extra damage and healing. This sounds really OP. Vladimir is a champion that's all about high damage and healing. However, the downside is that ranged champions such as VLADIMIR, instead of getting 2 stacks per auto attack, they get 1 stack per auto attack. This means that against ranged champions it will take you a long time to stack your Conqueror. If the enemies have a lot of melee champions, you will be able to attack them a lot more because of your range advantage, which means that you will stack your Conqueror quicker. So that's the first important thing. Conqueror is not that good when the enemies have a lot of ranged champions, so ideally you pick it when the enemies have a lot of melee champions. A second thing that's important to think about is whether or not you will have a lot of extended fights in your game. In order to be able to utilize your Conqueror to the fullest, you need the fights to be long enough for you to fully stack your Conqueror, and on top of that, you also need time to actually use your fully stacked Conqueror. This means that it's a lot better to pick Conqueror against tanks or bruisers instead of squishy champions such as mages, because mages will die a lot quicker, so you might not be able to stack your Conqueror. If we combine the two things we just covered, we should come to the conclusion that Conqueror ideally should be used against an enemy team comp with a lot of melee, tanks or bruisers. And just like Electrocute and Airy, Conqueror helps you to get lane priority in the early game because of the extra damage and healing you can get from it. The difference here is that Conqueror is both good in the early game and in the late game, but of course with the downside that ideally you should only use it against melee tanks or bruisers. I hope that clears up the Conqueror debate. Alright, let's move on to the last and maybe the most controversial keystone on VLADIMIR. Don't get me wrong, I don't see a lot of people use this rune setup, however I love it. I think that it's not only viable, but that it can be even optimal in certain situations. First Strike on VLADIMIR gives you for a brief moment 9% extra damage, and 70% of the damage you did you will also receive in gold. In my opinion, this is even better than what Conqueror gives you. Conqueror gives you extra damage and healing, but First Strike gives you extra damage and gold. Once you have some items on VLADIMIR, you are one of the highest damage dealing and strongest healing champions in the game. So in my opinion, you don't need the extra damage and healing that Conqueror gives you. However, in order to get strong, you need items. Obviously, you want to become strong before the game is over, which can be a big problem when playing VLADIMIR. The First Strike rune setup allows you to get your items as soon as possible. This rune setup is so good because it offers you so much more than just a keystone First Strike. The Inspiration rune tree also gives you magical footwear. Magical footwear basically gives you free boots of speed, which saves you 300 gold. On top of that, you can also select Futures Market. Futures Market allows you to enter depth to buy items. So to summarize all this, if you go to First Strike rune setup, you will get gold from First Strike, from Magical Footwear and from Futures Market. If you add all these things up, it can be a very OP rune setup because it allows you to get your power spikes quite a bit faster. So when should you use First Strike? Well, similar to Electrocute, in order to benefit from First Strike, first of all you have to proc it. After you damage an enemy champion, you will have 3 seconds time to burst your enemy, and the gold you receive is based on the extra damage that you did during those 3 seconds. However, into long range matchups such as Syndra, you might not be able to come close to the Syndra and burst her. It's likely that you will only be able to come into auto attack range with the Syndra. However, if you can only auto attack the Syndra once or twice, you will not get a lot of gold because you didn't do a lot of damage. So ideally, you use this rune setup whenever you can consistently burst your enemies, most of the time that will be against melee champions such as Talon, Yone, etc. Alright, we've come to an end. I did my best to explain every rune setup as good as possible, so hopefully this video was helpful. If it was, you can always leave a like and subscribe for more content like this. If you have a video suggestion, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. I want to thank you for watching and hopefully I'll catch you in my next video. Bye.